Open your Bible to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, that's where our study is going to be from this morning. And while you're turning there, let me just say hello. It's good to see all of you. I'm really excited about the lesson this morning. This is a lesson that I put a lot of study into, and because of that, it's helped me out. I've grown a lot, and I hope that the lesson will be beneficial to you as well. Hopefully you'll gain a lot from this lesson. The lesson is sort of going to be derived from Genesis chapter 1, and we're going to pick up in verse 24. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 24. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God made man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." In this section of scripture here in Genesis chapter 1, we see some interesting language about man being created in God's image. And the reason I say that this language is interesting is because it's not used of the rest of creation. Like if you read through Genesis chapter 1 and you read through the creation account, you see that the language isn't used for the other parts of creation. For light and darkness, that language isn't used. Light and darkness are not created in God's image. The trees are not created in God's image. The sun, the moon, the stars, they are not created in God's image. And even whenever you look at the other creatures that God created, how are they created? Look again in verse 24. "Let the earth bring forth creatures according to their kind." So the animals, they're created according to their kind, but man, we are different. We are created in God's image. And it's important that we understand that. It's important that we understand that we are created in the image of God, because if we don't understand it, then we don't see reality correctly. We start to see things differently than what they really are. And let me just give you an example. When we don't see that we're created in God's image, then we don't see humankind as special. And if we don't see humankind as special, then we trivialize human life. And we see that in the world today, don't we? Why is murder a thing? Well, because we as humans have failed to realize that we're all created in God's image. Why is theft or cheating a thing? Well, because we fail to realize that we're all created in God's image. Why is injustice a thing? Because we fail to realize that we're all created in God's image. Abortion. Why is that a thing? The same reason. We fail to realize that we all, even the unborn, are created in God's image. It's interesting that some in our society, they elevate animal lives, but they put down human life. They trivialize human life. You see, it's important that we understand that we are created in God's image. But let me say that it's also important that we understand what it means to be created in God's image, because that means something for us. And that's what we're going to study in the lesson this morning. We're going to talk about what it means to be image bearers for God, what it means to be created in God's image. So let's talk about it. Let's answer the question, what does it mean to be created in God's image? First of all, it means that we express God. And what I mean whenever I say that we express God, I mean that we express his attributes. You can look at humanity and see the attributes and the qualities of God. It's interesting. Sometimes we read through the Bible and we talk about how the Bible writers anthropomorphize God. And what that means is the Bible writers, they give human characteristics to God. For instance, have you read anywhere in the Bible that talks about God's hand? I'm sure you have. God's mighty hand bringing Israel out. Peter talks about humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God. And we'll read passages like that and say, well, see, the Bible writers are anthropomorphizing God. They're giving God these human characteristics. But I think it's better to say, instead of saying that they are anthropomorphizing God, I think it's better to say that humans are theomorphic. And what that means is that humans express God. And let me just give you a couple of examples to sort of cement that in your minds. God created us with mouths, didn't he? God created us with the ability to communicate, didn't he? Why? Well, because God himself communicates. The God who created the mouth surely can communicate himself, can't he? And God created us with eyes as well. Why? Well, because God himself sees. The God who created the eye surely can see, can't he? And God created us with ears as well. Why is that? Well, because God can hear. The God who created the ear surely can hear. And it's important for us to see that. It's important for us to understand that we express God in this way because sometimes when things get hard, we say to ourselves, well, God surely doesn't hear us. Or God surely doesn't see the suffering that I'm going through. It reminds me of the prophet Habakkuk. Turn to Habakkuk chapter 1. And while you're turning there, let me set the scene. Habakkuk is actually a very interesting prophet because the prophets, typically, the prophets are writing to the people for God. But Habakkuk is doing the opposite. Habakkuk is actually writing to God for the people. Habakkuk is bringing the people's complaint up to God and ultimately his complaint as well. Let's pick up reading Habakkuk chapter 1, picking up in verse 2. Habakkuk says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." So Habakkuk is talking to God, and he says, where are you? We're suffering. The wicked are overcoming the righteous. Where are you? Do you see what we're going through? Do you hear our cries? Well, we say the same things at times, don't we? In those times, we need to remember that we express God. Surely the God who created the ears can hear, can't he? Look again at another passage, Psalm 94. Psalm 94, in the context, we see something similar to what we saw in the book of Habakkuk. There are wicked people, and they are overcoming, they're persecuting the righteous. And it's not the righteous who cry out this time, but it's the wicked. The wicked are saying, your God doesn't hear you. Psalm 94, let's pick up in verse 1. The psalmist writes, O Lord, God of vengeance, O God of vengeance, shine forth. So the psalmist wants God to do something. He says, rise up, O judge of the earth, repay to the proud what they deserve. O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult? They pour out their arrogant words. All the evildoers boast. They crush your people, O Lord, and afflict your heritage. They kill the widow and the sojourner and murder the fatherless. And then they say, the Lord does not save, and the God of Jacob does not perceive. So here are the wicked people who are persecuting the righteous. They're saying, see, your God doesn't care about you. He can't hear you. He can't see you. But notice how the psalmist responds in verse 8. Understand, O dullest of the people, fools, when will you be wise? He who planted the ear, does he not hear? He who formed the eye, does he not see? See, the psalmist is making the exact same argument that we've been talking about. We express God. We are created in his image. We have ears because God hears us. We have eyes because God sees what we are going through. It's important that we understand this. So what does it mean to be created in God's image? Well, one, it means that we express God. Another thing that it means, and this will be a shorter point, but it means that we represent God's presence. And what I mean by this is that we are evidence that God exists. All you have to do is look at us and see, well, there surely is a God. You know, it's interesting, the question whether or not God exists is a fairly new one. You know, the ancients didn't struggle with that. In the ancient world, everyone believed in a God, maybe not the God of the Bible, but they all believed in a God. And I believe the reason for that is because they understood, just looking at creation, they understood, well, God must have done this. Someone must have done this. Paul makes the same argument In Romans chapter 1, Paul says, "For his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made." So Paul tells us, he says that his eternal power and divine nature in Romans 1:20, you can see it. How can you see it, Paul? He says you can see it in the things that have been made. So God's presence can be seen through his creation. But I think God's presence, can be especially seen through us, through humanity. I think we are God's special creation, and God tells us that. God tells us that we are his special creation. And through that, we see, well, God must surely have existed to create us, beings as special as we are, because we are not like the animals. Have you ever thought about that? We are not like the animals. We are so different from them. We think differently. We do things differently. I mean, think about it. Humans, we have reason. We have logic. Do the animals have that? No, they're driven by impulse. Humans, we can create art. We can create poetry. Do you see the animals creating art or poetry? I don't see any fish, creating great works of art. Maybe you've seen it. I don't know. I don't see it. See, we are different from the animals. And humans, we create and we innovate, don't we? I mean, just think about the history of humankind. Think about where we began versus where we are now. If you look at the beginning of human history, humans lived in sort of these very primitive houses. Maybe they lived in caves. Are we still living in houses or caves today? No, we're not. We live in sort of these technologically advanced houses. We can say, "Alexa, turn on whatever light," and you know what? Alexa turns it on, doesn't she? Right? We were so connected. There's electricity. There's Wi-Fi bouncing off the walls and stuff. We create. We innovate. The animals don't do that. Think about the birds. If you go back to the beginning of the beginning of bird history, sure. If you go back to the beginning of bird history, where were they living? They were living in nests, weren't they? Where are they living today? Still living in nests. There aren't any, electrically powered trees that the birds are living in or anything like that. And think about the fish of the sea. Where are they living? They're not living in pineapples under the sea. Fish, I honestly don't know where fish live, but they're not living in houses down there, honestly, if we think about it, right? They don't create. They don't innovate. Humans do. So it's evident to anyone who's looking, just by looking at us, looking at humanity, that God exists. So what does it mean to be created in God's image? It means we represent God's presence. But one final point, and this is the most important point. This is the point I want you to hold on to. What does it mean to be created in God's image? It means that we rule for God. And that's the primary thing it means. Being created in God's image can mean a lot of things, but the primary thing it means is that we rule for God. And we see this in Genesis chapter 1. Turn back there. Genesis chapter 1. And while you're turning there, I'll tell you sort of the history of interpretation, because there's a lot of history behind the interpretation of this idea of man being created in God's image. Throughout history, some people have said, well, what that means is it means that we're logical. Yeah, it means that. Other people have said, well, that means that we have a soul. Yeah, it means that. Other people have said, well, it means that we're God's special creation. Yes, of course, it means that. But the Jews, it's interesting, when the ancient Jews would read this passage, and they would say, okay, well, what does this mean? What does it mean to be created in God's image? You know how they would answer it? They would say, well, let's just look at the context. So let's do that. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And the Jews might say, what does it mean? And someone else might say, well, just keep reading. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So being created in God's image means that we rule for God. I actually like the way the NIV translates this verse. The NIV says something along the lines of, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, so that they may have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and so on, and so forth. That's the idea. Being created in God's image means that we rule, and not just rule any kind of way, but we rule righteously for God. In other words, being created in God's image is not just this noun or adjective. It's a verb. It's something we do. We are image bearers for God. We are to image him. we rule righteously for him. And Jesus makes that clear in the Gospels, by the way, through the use of some parables. Turn over to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25, I'll set the scene for you. In the context, Jesus is talking about final judgment. He's talking about the end, and he's telling his disciples what they need to do to be prepared for the end. In each of these parables, there's actually 3 of them, but we're only going to focus on 2. In each of these parables, there are 2 groups of people. The group that does what they're supposed to do, and the group that does not do what they're supposed to do. Matthew chapter 25, let's pick up in verse 14. Jesus says, "For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away." And we know the context of the rest of this parable. In the context, this master, he gives his servants temporary rule over his property. He gives one man 5 talents, another man 2 talents, another man 1 talent, and they're supposed to rule righteously over what he has given them. And if they rule righteously, he will bless them. We saw that with the 5-talent man. We saw that with the 2-talent man. But if they don't rule over what he has given them righteously, then there's punishment. We see that at the end of this parable in verse 30. It says, "And he cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So what does the parable teach us about us? Well, it teaches us that we are to rule righteously over what God has given us, over his creation. Look again in another, earlier in this passage, Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, we'll pick up in verse 45, and here Jesus tells a similar parable. He says, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household?" So again, the master has given a temporary rulership to the servant. So who is this faithful and wise servant who the master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed,' and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour when he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." See, the master gave his servant rule over his stuff, and he expected the servant to rule righteously. That's the lesson for us. As image bearers for God, God has sort of symbolically given us a throne. And it's not that we're equal with God. It's that we rule under him. We rule for him and with him. God is above us, but he wants us to rule over his creation. And if we do that, then we will be rewarded. If we do that, we will be given more responsibility in the next life. And Paul talks about this a little bit. Turn over to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 2. These are sort of Paul's dying words to the one who he considered his son, Timothy. And in the context, Paul is teaching Timothy how to be a good soldier for Christ. And in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 12, Paul says, "If we endure, we will also reign with him." So Paul is telling Timothy, if we endure in this life, if we live righteously, if we rule righteously, then we will reign with Christ in the end. And look again in another passage, Revelation chapter 3 now. Revelation chapter 3, this is the letter to the 7 churches, Jesus' letter to the 7 churches. And in the specific context, Jesus is talking to the church at Laodicea. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 21. It says, and Jesus is speaking here, "The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." What's Jesus telling these people? Well, if you conquer, if you endure this persecution, if you stay righteous, if you rule righteously, there's a throne waiting for you. You will rule with me, for me, in eternity. So that's what it means to be created in God's image. Being created in God's image means we must rule righteously for God. But how do we do that? How do we rule righteously for God? I'll give you 3 quick things. First of all, it means we take care of God's creation. Ruling righteously for God means we take care of one another. We look out for one another, for other humans. But also, it means taking care of God's creation just in general. We take care of the animals as well. We don't, mistreat or abuse the animals. I understand the animals are not humans, and I don't elevate animals to be humans. But part of what it means to be created in God's image means we take care of all of God's creation. Typically whenever we read Genesis chapter 1 and it talks about man having dominion over the animals, we start to think food, right? But that's not what God is talking about in Genesis chapter 1. Because in Genesis chapter 1, Adam and Eve actually didn't eat animals. God told them to eat the fruit of the ground with seed in it and eat from the trees. So they were kind of like vegans. And I'm not pushing veganism or anything like that, but that's what they were. And God tells them to have dominion over the animals. What did it mean for them? It meant to take care of the animals. Rule over them righteously. So that's part of what it means. It means we've got to take care of God's creation. But also it means we've got to lead our families righteously. We've got to lead our families according to God's will. If you're a mother, you're a father, you're a husband, you're a wife, we've got responsibilities to do with regard to our family because that's a blessing that God has given us. We've got to take care of our families. But one more thing. It also means, and this is just the big overarching theme, it also means that we just live righteously. We live righteous lives. And if we do that, if we live righteous lives, then we are truly imaging God, where we are fulfilling what humanity is supposed to be or humanity is supposed to do. We're truly human. And that's what it means to be created in God's image. It means that we live righteously for God. But the sad thing, I guess, is that we don't always do this. In the beginning, God sort of offered man, God offered humans this throne. They were supposed to rule righteously for him. But we vacated the throne through sin in Genesis chapter 3. Because of Genesis chapter 3, we failed to truly image God. We failed to truly rule righteously for God, and that's why we need Jesus. Turn over in your Bible to the book of Colossians. Colossians chapter 1. We need Jesus because he is the true image of God. And that's the argument that Paul is making in Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1, we'll pick up in verse 15 here, and Paul is talking about Jesus in this context. He's talking about the one who delivered us from the domain of darkness. And he says, Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So you see, Jesus is the one who truly rules righteously for God. Jesus is the one who truly images God. He's the one who is truly human, in other words. Look again, Colossians chapter 3 now. Colossians chapter 3, and what we see is since Christ is the one who is truly God's image, it is through him that we become righteous. It is through him that we become image bearers again. Paul says in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 9, "Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." You see, at times we fail at being image bearers of God, but by putting on the new self, Jesus helps us to become true image bearers again. By putting on the new self, we proclaim that we are going to be true images, true humans, and live righteously according to God's will. That's the lesson. That's what it means to be created in God's image. I know that's a lot, and that was deep, but essentially it means we've got to live righteously, and that's it. So let me ask, maybe there's someone here this morning who has not been living righteously. Maybe there's someone here this morning who has not been truly imaging God. You've left the Lord and you want to come back. Well, we'd love to have you back. Or maybe there's someone who wants to start their walk with Christ for the first time. They want to put off that old self, put on the new self in baptism, and allow Jesus to help you to become righteous. Oh, we'd love you to do that. If you need to respond to the invitation, you can come now as we stand and as we sing.